Hello, folks. Welcome to the installation and deployment webcast for Dynamics AX 2012 R3 for retail. I am Amir Alakaband, and I am a program manager in Microsoft Dynamics. This webcast, some of you may be watching this as part of your CTP4 walkthroughs. Others may be watching this webcast at a later time. Keep in mind that as of today, the product is still pre-release, so things may change between now and until the time that we actually release the product. Having said that, the intent of this webcast is to give you a high-level overview of how you can actually go about installing the R3 solution for retail. And it's important to note that for this release, there have been several new components that have been made available as part of the release. So if you're familiar with the R3 release of our product, some things may look similar, but there are quite a few things that have newly been introduced that it would be helpful for me to walk you through those components and how to install and deploy those. So let's start and take a quick look at the general scope of things that we will be covering as part of this webcast. So in the R3 release, generally we've put components into certain buckets with respect to the enhancements and improvements that we've made in the installation experience. Starting with the point of sale, in case you watched the other webcasts or you read other documentation, for the R3 release, we're introducing a new point of sale system. So the existing point of sale system, the retail point of sale system, was a traditional x86 application running on the Windows desktop. In the R3 release, we are introducing the modern point of sale application, which will be running as a Windows 8 style app. So we have set up support for both of those applications. For our databases, what used to be known as the store database in R2, in the R2 release timeframe, is now the channel database. So I'll talk more about it when we look at a sample topology, but the general idea being that this would be a common database used by the different channels in our solution, whether it's the brick and mortar store channel or it is the online channel. It would be a common database that could be redeployed in different contexts. Then we have the commerce data exchange. So if you remember in the R2 timeframe, the common component, the two components there were the real-time service and the sync service. In the R3 timeframe, we've overhauled the sync service component, which now becomes a standard client-server architecture type of component. So in that case, we have the async server and async client, which replaced the previous sync service component. Having said that, you may notice in setup an entry for sync service, which refers to the previous generation component. This is primarily for folks who may have specific needs to deploy the older version, but the expectation in all standard installations would be that the async server and the async client would be sufficient, and you would not need to deploy the older component, the sync service component. Then we look at another new component that we've introduced in the R3 release. This is the retail server. I'll talk more about each of these components when we look at the topology diagram, and I'll give you some insights into how you may be able to plan out deployment and at least at the basic stage understand how to deploy. But the retail server is the you can think of retail server as being the replacement, the retail server along with the modern point of sale being the replacement for the traditional point of sale system. So That's the retail server component. The other piece in the retail server component is the retail hardware station. This is an optional component that you may choose to deploy in your store. The benefit of using the hardware station would be to allow you within the store to connect peripheral devices to this hardware station so that your modern point of sale client can actually access this retail hardware station. So for each of these components, there will be specific webcasts that will explain more about the typical scenarios covered by each of the components. So what I'm saying here will be very brief, just to give you some context with relation to the installation of these components. Likewise, we have the retail online channel. So we made major investments in this area where we realized a number of scenarios existed where folks would want to have an easier way to deploy an out-of-box storefront for purposes of demos or internal testing or just getting familiar with the solution. So we've incorporated deployment of the online storefront within the standard installation experience. Some of the other components that we've included in installation. One of the components is a manageability toolkit. I'll talk about this in a separate session about how it fits into the overall scheme of things and how we've made major investments in mass deployment of components using System Center Configuration Manager. Be sure to watch that session as well, as it can be very useful technique to deploy in a large environment all of the retail components. And then the other existing components that are already part of the installation experience, the retail SDK. It's already part of standard installation experience, but there have definitely been improvements here. Retail headquarters, again, part of the retail installation experience. There have been improvements here as well. And then the older sync service that I had alluded to earlier. Just to spend a few seconds talking about what retail headquarters means here, in case it wasn't obvious from the name itself. So the idea of having this specific component called retail headquarters as an installable component is that it provides specific runtime dependencies that are required by your AOS component and your AX client. So if you wanted to run retail in Dynamics AX, once you install your AOS, you would then install on that same computer your retail headquarters component, and on each computer that you install the AX primary client, you would also install your retail headquarters there. Now, all of this that I talked about makes the assumption that you already have AOS and AX and the AX databases already installed in your environment. You can look up specific documentation on how to install AX and AOS and the AX databases. More information will be available on the Connect website. But the focus here is specifically on the retail side of the deployment, since it tends to be a little bit more elaborate compared to the AX headquarters side installation. So the next thing I'm going to do now is I've drawn up a sample topology, a very simple basic topology of the various retail components and how they interact with each other and how you may be able to deploy the retail components in your environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of the components, and I'll explain how each of the components work in the larger picture here. So let's start on the headquarters side. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So we focus in. So here you'll see what we have is the AOS and AX database deployment. So this is standard for any deployment of the Dynamics AX product line. You'll see we have in this sample deployment, it's a very basic deployment to give you an idea of how things might work. We have one AX database installed. You can run installer, install the AX database. Give me 1 second. So I've got the laser pointer here, and let me zoom in. So your AX database can be installed on the headquarters side. Right next to your AX database, you can install your AOS component. Again, you can use the standard installation procedure to install your AOS and point it to your AX database. Once you have that set up, the next thing you would do is you would install your retail headquarters component using your retail or your standard installer. The headquarters part gives the runtime dependencies, as I had mentioned before. Once you have your AOS set up, the next thing you can do is you can set up your AX client. And once you install your AX client, then you would also need to install the retail headquarters component on that computer that you installed your AX client on. Now, once you have these basic components set up, the next thing in a recommended sequence would be to look at the commerce data exchange part of the system. Now, setting up the commerce data exchange part of the system first would be the recommended way to go, so that once you start installing your channel side components, the configuration becomes more straightforward and easier. So in Commerce Data Exchange, we have two specific components, as I had mentioned earlier. And the two components are your async server and your real-time service. Async server right here and your real-time service right here. Now, real-time service component of Commerce Data Exchange communicates with the AX component here. Now it does use another component for the communication, but at a simple level, this is basically what's happening. And the async server, which is the newer component we've introduced in this release, is a little bit more involved, so to speak, in that it interacts with a number of different components to provide the great performance that it does. So the async server here does not directly communicate with the AOS, if you noticed. Instead, what happens is the AOS communicates with a headquarters message database for async server and with specific upload and download folders. The async server, on the other hand, when you install it, also talks to these same folders and the message database to exchange information. So that way, the AOS and the async server are loosely coupled. In particular, the async server does not need to know about the location or existence of the AOS. Likewise, AOS only needs to know about these intermediaries and not specifically about each instance of async server. Now, what I'm talking about here, keep in mind, is a standard installation. I'm not referring to mass deployment scenarios using System Center, which will be covered in a separate webcast. Keep in mind that you may encounter forms and menu items in AX over here, which make references to other components across your entire topology. Those forms will be clearly marked, and those forms are specifically for mass deployment scenarios using System Center. Those forms do not refer to standard installation. So this webcast is specifically standard installation. In standard installation, your AOS does not know about the existence of the async servers, and async servers, vice versa, don't know about the existence and location of your AOS. Now, moving forward, how would you actually install async server and real-time service? Again, between these two, there is no recommended sequence. You can install either of these first, since they don't directly interact with each other. Let's look at the async server first. So when you run the installer for async server, it'll ask you to provide it specific configuration values for the website name. So before I get to that, the async server, as well as the real-time service and other components, are IIS web applications. So in case of async server, it'll ask you to provide configuration values about the name of the website, the name of the web application, the application pool to run the website under, preferred ports for communication, and it'll ask you some specific configuration which is unique to async server versus the other components. First thing it's going to ask you after you provide the basic information is to provide it with a location where it will create a message database for you. Now, it's very important to understand that the message database here, the HQ message database, will be a single instance per partition of AX, meaning even if you had multiple async server instances in your environment right here next to this, they would all still talk to the same HQ message database. And in AX, when you specify a configuration about the HQ message database, you'll only be able to provide the location of this one message database per partition. Now, when you run installer and you provided this information about the AX configuration and you provided the information required to create this message database, so it'll ask you what database server and instance you would like to create the database on, as well as the desired message database name. So once you provide it with that information, installer is going to install your async server in IIS. And at the same time, it is also going to create this message database. Once that is done, under the covers, the installer will also create these two working folders. Now, once this has all been configured, and suppose you wanted to install an additional async server, what you would then do is you would provide the second instance its own configurations as required. And instead of expecting it to create a new database, you should point to this existing message database instead of trying to create a new message database. And it will connect to that existing message database. So moving on with async server, you'll notice that the other corresponding piece to the async server are the async clients on the channel side. So we have an async client here, we have another one here. So imagine this is an online channel, this is a store, this is another physical store. Now you'll notice these async clients here and here and here. These are the components that directly connect with the async server. And what they essentially do is they replicate data into the channel database. So you can imagine a packet of data has been dispatched from AOS and it's been put into the working folders. And from there, so again, I'm trying to give you a very brief introduction about how the async server and client works, but there will be specific webcasts that talk in significantly more detail about how the async server and client work and the improvements available there and any other specific guideline. But just from an installation perspective, it helps you understand what this component does. The data packet reaches, so data packet is available in the folders served up by the server, and the client then is able to fetch that data from the service, and it's able to populate the channel database, to speak very simply. It's a little bit more nuanced, but from the purposes of installation, it's sufficient to understand that the data is available then in the retail channel database. So having said that, once you are done installing the components on the Commerce Data Exchange front, you then move to the channel side. And the channel side for async server, the recommended way is to first install your channel database. Once you install your channel database, you can then move on to installing your async client, so that in the installation, you can specify which channel database it should work with on the channel side, as well as be able to provide the URL of the async server that it should connect to. In addition, the async client installation will ask you similarly to provide it with the name of a database server and instance where it can create a channel message database. Now, once you provide that information, much like on the headquarters side, it will create a channel message database for you as part of the installation of async client. Now, keep in mind that the async client installation will not create a new channel database. It will only create its corresponding message database that it uses for its own data processing. The channel database installation, formerly in the auto release, if you are familiar with that solution, we used a component called database utility to actually create a what we used to call a store database. In the R3 release, how the process works now is we have created a specific menu item in the installer called the retail channel database. So to install a retail channel database, much simpler than before, you simply select the component for installation and you specify the database server and instance along with the name of the desired name of the database that you wish to install, and installer will go ahead and it will install the channel database for you, so that when you install other components that communicate or connect with the channel database, you are able to only specify the location of the database, and the other components don't have to recreate a database. So async client will only connect to a channel database, but as part of the installation, it will also create a channel database. Now, the next component I would want to talk about here is your retail point of sale. So what's the story for installing the retail point of sale? For retail point of sale, you would run through the installer. It's a little bit different than most of the components. So pay a little bit more close attention here. So you run through the installer, you select retail point of sale from the setup menu, and you install it. Once this is installed, the next thing you need to do is you need to run the database utility. Let me rephrase that. Once this is installed, you need to go back to the setup menu and you need to install the retail database utility on that computer. Once you have installed the database utility on that computer, you would use that utility to configure retail point of sale. And by configure, there's a few key things, a few key pieces of information you need to provide it. the first thing you'd need to provide it would be the store name that identifies with that point of sale. So suppose your store was store 1, you would specify store 1 as the store name. Next, you would need to specify the register ID. If your point of sale corresponded to a register entity that you had created already in AX, let's say terminal 0101, you would specify that value in this configuration here and say this is terminal 0101. The third piece of information that you need to specify here is which legal entity does this register belong to. So you would provide the legal entity name as well. These three pieces of information are key. The next piece of information, as you might have noticed here, that retail point of sale requires, is to know the channel database that it must connect to. So you would provide it with the channel database server and the instance of that server on which the channel database is installed, and you'd provide it with the name of the channel database. Using all this information, Retail POS is now fully configured and is now able to connect to the retail channel database. The next component I'd like to talk about here is the retail server and the modern POS. Let me zoom in for a second so you can see clearly what we have here. So retail server is one of the newer components that we've introduced in the R3 release. And again, there will be specific webcasts that describe the functionality and the topology and the layout of this component in more detail. But to give you a basic overview, the retail server, along with the modern POS, replaces the functionality provided by retail point of sale. The idea being that you can install a retail server in your store as a server, and you can have multiple thin clients connecting to that one instance of retail server. In which case, from an installation perspective, you would again run the installer and you would select the installation of retail server from the setup menu. Once you've done that, it would again bring up specific configurations that you'd need to provide, like the real-time service and async server. Retail server is also an IIS web application. So it will ask you many similar configuration values, such as your website name, web application name, application pool name, and so forth, that it needs to deploy retail server to an IIS web application. The second piece of information, or the second set of information that it will ask you, would be to specify the database server and instance on which the channel database resides, along with the name of the channel database. So it's completely plausible that in a given store, you could have your retail POS as well as your retail server both connecting to the same retail channel database. Now, once you've specified that information, again, keep in mind that the assumption that the installer will make is that the channel database has been independently installed already. Now, you may choose to install retail server before the channel database is even available or even set up, and should still work. But to keep things simple while you are managing this, the recommended sequence is that you already set up your channel database, after which you install your retail server and you point your retail server to connect to this channel database. Once you have your retail server set up, the next thing you can do is you can install your modern point of sale application. So the retail modern POS can be installed using AX setup on your x86 or 64-bit computers. installing retail modern POS on an ARM or WinRT device is a little bit more involved. It has more steps, but that will be documented separately, and documentation will be available to you as part of installation documentation, which talks about how you can install this application, or how you can sideload this application on a WinRT device. For the purposes of a standard installation using AX setup, it will work in a similar fashion as other components on your x86 and 64-bit computers. So to install modern POS, you'd run your installer using AX setup, and you'd install this application. Now keep in mind, being a Windows 8 style application, the installer will not surface any configuration values to you as part of the installation experience. In the event that you are installing this application on certain editions of Windows, it may ask you for a sideloading activation key. Or in other cases, depending on the edition of Windows you're using, it may not ask you that. But aside from that, the majority of the configuration required for the modern POS will not be surfaced as part of the installer. So the way to configure the modern point of sale application would be, after you've installed the application and you launch the application, there will be a process called device activation. This process will also be covered in a separate webcast, but to give you a brief overview, the idea of the activation process would be to capture configuration from an authorized user to activate the device for access to the retail server. As part of that activation process, you would provide the URL of your retail server, you would provide your store ID, you would provide your personnel ID and your credentials, and then you would activate the device. So that's how configuration and activation are combined in the modern POS application. Now, once you've set up one of the stores, if you wanted to set up a second store, I've created a second store to show some variation and some additional components. You can go ahead and do a similar thing, in that you can leave the headquarter components, such as the Commerce Data Exchange or your async server and real-time service. Those can be reused across multiple stores, whereas in each specific store, a typical common deployment would include your channel database, one channel database for each store. It would include an async client to synchronize data between the channel database and HQ. And async client would have its own message database to facilitate the data transfer. And you could have your retail point of sale, your existing retail point of sale. And some of you may already know this from our previous releases, that a retail point of sale also supports an offline mode. So the offline mode supports is the ability to have a database on the same computer as a retail point of sale to provide a copy of data in case your retail point of sale was not able to access your retail channel database. So the idea here being that you would install a Windows service called an offline sync service, which would synchronize data between your retail channel database, so like the primary database in your store, with a local offline database, meaning the database residing locally on the point of sale computer. How this would be installed would be similar to how it was installed in R2, in that you use the database utility on the computer, on the retail point of sale computer, for instance. And after you've installed the offline sync service, you download this from a given URL, which can be found in documentation. Once you install the offline sync service and you download and install it, then you run the database utility and you select the option to provision an offline database. What that would mean is you provide parameters that indicate to the offline sync service which channel database and which offline database need to be synchronized. So in this case, you would specify this retail channel database in store 2 as the channel database to synchronize with, and you would specify this local offline database in store 2 as the one with which you would want to synchronize the data. This can be done as part of a standard configuration of point of sale using database utility, or the offline database can also be provisioned after the fact. Afterwards, once you already installed and configured the retail point of sale terminal, you can configure the offline database later on as well. Now, these were the standard brick and mortar store deployment scenarios. Now, the other scenario here is the online channel deployment. Now, how this one would work would be somewhat similar to how this worked in the R2 release. Here you'll see once you've already installed your SharePoint server, which is a prerequisite, once you install your SharePoint server and you install all the prerequisites required for the online storefront to work, what you would do is you would then launch AX installer and you would install a channel database. So the recommendation here being that it's best to have a dedicated retail channel database for your online channel instead of sharing a channel database between your online channel and your brick and mortar channels. So you go ahead, run your installer, and you create your channel database for your online channel deployment. Once you're done with that, then you select the async client deployment and you install the corresponding message database for async client. And as part of your async client installation and configuration, you specify which retail channel database it needs to connect with. You need to specify the URL of the async server it needs to connect with, and so on and so forth. And once you have your channel database and your async client and your message database all set up, the last piece of the puzzle is to run the installer and select the setup option to install the retail online channel component. What that will do is that will give you an out-of-box storefront installed on your SharePoint installation that you already have. And with that, we looked at a very high-level overview of a sample deployment of all the retail components. There is one other channel that we've introduced as part of R3, your call center channel. That can simply be accessed through any AX client that you can install through setup and select the specific menu item for AX client. There is no additional setup or installation requirement for that channel. So let me zoom out and give you another high-level overview. You have your AOS AX database deployment here. You have your commerce data exchange, async server, and real-time service. So one thing about real-time service that I didn't mention until now is you'll notice that real-time service connects directly with your retail point of sale and your retail server. So real-time service provides as the name suggests, real-time synchronous communication for specific use cases in your point of sale. So your retail server and point of sale connect directly with your real-time service. Having said that, though, at the time of installation of your retail POS or your retail server, you do not need to provide the URL of the real-time service. And you may ask, how does it get the how does your retail server and your retail POS actually connect to it if we don't provide it during installation? So what happens is this information is actually created in your AX in the headquarter. So in your AX in your headquarter, there is this thing called a real-time service profile, where you specify the connection string for connecting to your real-time service instance. Now what happens is this piece of information goes from AX to your upload and download folders that are served up by async server, and from there that information goes to your AX client, and from AX client it goes to your channel database. And your retail point of sale actually reads that information from your channel database and uses that connection string to connect to your real-time service. Likewise, that same information can also be used by retail server to connect to your real-time service. So in that case, it is a configuration that can easily be changed in HQ if your deployment so requires at any given time. So that is one thing that is not required in these components at the time of installation. Now that I've talked about briefly all of the key components and how they interact with each other and what kinds of configurations are required at what points of time during the installation process, you can now go ahead and you can look at the installation document for installing retail components. And then you can decide what topology would be ideal for your scenarios and how you'd like to deploy retail components in your environment. Before I end this webcast, I'd like to add a few other useful hints about more realistic deployments where you'll have multiple instances of these components. So what you can do, suppose you wanted to install multiple components to add significant additional load from your clients. So for your async server, you could install n number of these instances side by side, ideally on different computers, and you could put a load balancer in front of your async server, and you could have the load balancer in whatever fashion. You could have a round robin, or the load balancer could assess the load on each of the machines. And you could have the load balancer dynamically send incoming requests to any of the other instances of async server. And when you are installing your async client, you'd actually provide the URL of the, and I would suggest for most production scenarios, a hardware-based load balancer. So the address of the hardware load balancer would be the address that you'd provide to your async clients. And once the request comes here, the load balancer would dynamically allocate it to any of the other instances of async server. Once the request gets there, all of the async server instances would all use the same upload download folders, and they would all talk to the same HQ message database. Likewise, with your real-time service, you could also add a hardware load balancer so that all incoming traffic gets dynamically routed to an appropriate instance of real-time service. And to support that scenario, what you would do is, when you are defining the real-time service profile in AX for your retail POS and retail server to use, in that profile, instead of providing the actual connection string for your real-time services, you would provide the connection string to your load balancer. And when that information goes down to the channel database, your real-time, your retail POS and your retail server would use that information to connect to the load balancer, and the load balancer in turn would dynamically route the queries to a different instance. So that was just a brief overview of installation and deployment planning for AX for retail in the R3 release. And before we close, let's take a look at some helpful hints and caveats. One of the things you'll need to keep in mind is that the R3 solution of AX 2012 for retail, for deploying your online channel, you need to have SharePoint 2013 installed on your computer. Now, SharePoint 2013, as of now, is not officially supported on Windows Server 2012 R2. It's probably just a matter of time before official support is provided and announced for this version of SharePoint on Server 2012 R2. But as of now, SharePoint 2013 only works on Windows Server 2012. So you can try it out on that version of Windows, or you can wait for a certain period of time before the support becomes available. The next point I'd like to make here is the retail modern point of sale, the Windows 8 style application that we are releasing as part of R3 release, will require installation on Windows 8.1 only, which means if you try to install this application on Windows 8, it will not work. You require Windows 8.1 and above. So at this point, it's just Windows 8.1, but that's the minimum requirement. So Windows 8.1 would also mean all your SKUs of Windows 8.1 along with your Windows 2012 R2 SKU if you so choose to install on a server edition of Windows. The next thing to keep in mind is your CDX HQ side components, your async server and your real-time service will not function without an SSL certificate and without binding to HTTPS or secure ports. This is different from how your retail server and your hardware station function, in that they do not require a secure connection. So if you wanted to do internal evaluation or demo or so forth, the CDX components would still require secure communication, whereas your retail server and hardware station would not require that. And in any case, for all production scenarios, we strongly encourage that all communication is over a secure channel. Another thing to keep in mind is if you are using the setup provided in CTP4 release, there may be certain prerequisites that setup may not be checking for. There will be specific documentation and guidelines available along with the CTP4 release that will help you along the way. But it's certainly the case that if you do not read the documentation and just walk through the installer, and even if the installer indicates that all prerequisites have been met, there may be prerequisites that have actually not been met, which could lead to your installation failing. So be sure to read the documentation there. Another thing to keep in mind is in the CTP4 setup experience, if you try to install the retail modern point of sale system, it will only install for the current user. It will not install for all users of that computer. If you wish to install for the CTP4 release the retail modern POS for all users or for multiple users on the computer, you will need to read specific documentation steps on how that can be done. Standard installation will only install it for the current user, and it will prevent other users on that same computer from installing that same component using AX setup again. So those are the caveats, and I already talked about the installation sequence. We can do a quick recap. Start with your AX database on the HQ side, then move on to your AOS, and once you install your AOS, you also install retail headquarter component. After that, you install your AX client, and then you install your retail headquarter component. After that, you install your CDX, the Commerce Data Exchange pieces on the headquarter side, your async server, and your real-time service. Then you move to the channel, and the channel, I would suggest that you start with the channel database. After the channel database, you move on to the async client, so that the async client can start retrieving data from the headquarter side. Then you install your retail point of sale system. After that, you can install your retail server and hardware station so that they can then be used by your modern point of sale client. And at any given time, irrespective of your traditional channels, you can also install the online storefront. So with that, I will be concluding this webcast. Thanks again for watching the webcast, and be sure to read the documentation that goes along with this webcast. Thanks again. Goodbye.